Greg Morris wheeled himself down the jet bridge, his heart beating fast with excitement. Today was special. After months of saving airline points and planning, he was finally taking a first-class flight to Seattle to visit his brother. Greg worked as a software engineer, and at 38 years old, he had learned to manage his life from a wheelchair quite well. But traveling always brought extra challenges. 5 years ago, Greg had beaten cancer. The doctors had given him only a 30% chance of survival, but he fought hard and won. His mother had given him a silver medallion necklace before his first treatment. For strength, she had told him. She passed away during his second year of treatment, but Greg kept wearing the necklace every day. It was his connection to her, and a reminder of his victory over cancer. The airline staff at the gate had been helpful, arranging for him to board first so he could take his time getting settled. Greg had splurged on this trip, using all his saved points for a first-class ticket. His disability made sitting in the cramped economy seats painful on long flights, and the cross-country journey would take nearly 6 hours. "Good morning, sir. Let me help you with that," said a friendly male flight attendant named Paul as Greg reached the airplane door. Paul helped Greg transfer from his wheelchair to the aisle chair, a narrow wheelchair designed to fit down the airplane aisle. "I'm in seat 2C, Greg said, handing Paul his boarding pass. "Perfect. We'll get you there comfortably," Paul replied, carefully pushing the aisle chair to the second row in first class. The cabin was still mostly empty. Only 2 other passengers had boarded so far, an older man in a business suit reading a newspaper, and a middle-aged woman typing on her laptop. Greg transferred from the aisle chair to his spacious first-class seat with some effort, but managed without asking for help. He felt proud of that. Independence mattered to him. "Your wheelchair will be stored below, sir. Is there anything else you need before the other passengers board?" Paul asked. "No, I'm all set." "Thank you," Greg replied, settling into the wide, comfortable seat. He couldn't help but smile. This was such a treat compared to his usual flying experience. Greg placed his small backpack under the seat in front of him and took out his phone to text his brother. "Just boarded. First class is amazing. See you in about 6 hours." He sent the message and then took a deep breath, enjoying the moment of peace before the plane filled up. His peace was interrupted by a sharp voice. "Excuse me." Greg looked up to see a female flight attendant standing in the aisle next to his seat. Her name tag read, Diane Powell. She looked to be in her 50s with her brown hair pulled back in a tight bun. Unlike Paul's warm smile, Diane's expression was stiff and unwelcoming. "Yes?" Greg asked politely. "Are you sure you're in the right section?" Diane asked, her eyes moving from his face to his wheelchair being stowed by the ground crew through the window. Greg felt a familiar sinking feeling in his stomach. He had experienced this kind of questioning before. "Yes, I'm in the right seat." 2C, he replied calmly, showing her his boarding pass on his phone. Diane barely glanced at it before her eyes settled on the silver medallion hanging outside his button-up shirt. The medallion wasn't fancy, just a simple silver disc with a tree of life etched into it. But to Greg, it was priceless. "We have a dress code in first class," she said coolly. "That necklace doesn't meet our standards. Perhaps you'd be more comfortable in economy." Greg felt his face grow hot with embarrassment. The other passengers in first class were now looking at him. The woman with the laptop had stopped typing and was watching the interaction with a frown. "There's nothing in the airline policy about necklaces," Greg said, trying to keep his voice steady. "And this has special meaning to me. It's from my mother. I'm a cancer survivor and, I'm sorry, but I need to enforce our standards." Diane cut him off. "First-class passengers are expected to dress appropriately." Greg's heart raced. Was this really happening? He had been so excited about this trip, and now this flight attendant was suggesting he didn't belong in first class because of his mother's necklace. "I don't understand," Greg said. "What exactly is inappropriate about my necklace?" "It's too casual for first class," Diane replied, loud enough that everyone nearby could hear. "We try to maintain a certain atmosphere up here." The older man with the newspaper had lowered it to watch. His expression showed disapproval, but Greg couldn't tell if it was directed at him or at Diane. "I paid for this seat just like everyone else," Greg said, his voice a bit stronger now. And there is absolutely nothing in the airline policy about jewelry. The woman across the aisle suddenly spoke up. Excuse me, she said to Diane. I fly first class with this airline at least twice a month, and I've never heard of a jewelry policy. Could you please show us where that's written? Greg gave the woman a grateful look. She had short blonde hair and kind eyes. She was dressed in a casual but elegant outfit, certainly nothing overly formal. I don't have the policy with me, Diane said, her confidence wavering slightly. But as senior cabin crew, I use my discretion on appropriate attire. My name is Kate Miller, the woman said, introducing herself. I'm an attorney, and I'd be very interested to see this policy. Because singling out a passenger, especially one with a disability, without a clear written policy seems problematic. Diane's face flushed. I'm not singling him out because of his disability. It's the necklace that's inappropriate. By now, other passengers were boarding, creating a line in the aisle. They were trying not to stare, but Greg could feel their curious glances. His perfect trip was turning into a nightmare. Paul returned to the first-class cabin and immediately sensed the tension. Is everything okay here? He asked, looking between Greg, Kate, and Diane. Your colleague seems to think my necklace violates some first-class dress code, Greg explained, trying to keep his voice from shaking. This necklace was a gift from my mother before she died. I wear it every day. Paul looked confused. I'm not aware of any policy against necklaces, he said carefully, glancing at Diane. Perhaps you haven't been properly trained on maintaining our premium cabin standards, Diane replied to Paul coldly. Then she turned back to Greg. If you insist on keeping the necklace visible, I'll need to speak to the captain about this situation. Kate stood up from her seat. I'd like to speak to the captain as well then, and I'd like to know your full name and employee number, please. A few more first-class passengers had taken their seats now, and they were all watching the scene unfold. Greg felt like he was on display. All he had wanted was a comfortable flight to visit his brother and celebrate his 5 years of being cancer-free. Now he was the center of an embarrassing confrontation. Is there a problem here? A new voice joined the conversation. A tall man in a pilot's uniform stood at the entrance to the first-class cabin. Captain Harris, Diane said, straightening her posture. I was just explaining our dress code policy to this passenger. Captain Harris looked at Greg, then at his necklace, then back at Diane with a puzzled expression. What dress code policy are you referring to, Diane? The one about appropriate attire in first class, Diane stammered. Sir, Captain Harris addressed Greg directly. Is there a problem with your seating arrangement? No, sir, Greg replied. I'm comfortable in my assigned seat. The flight attendant seems to have an issue with my necklace, which has deep personal significance to me. It was a gift from my mother before she passed away. Captain Harris nodded thoughtfully. I see. Well, I'm not aware of any policy that would prohibit wearing a necklace in any cabin of our aircraft. He turned to Diane. Could I speak with you, privately for a moment? As Diane followed the captain to the galley area, Kate leaned over toward Greg. Are you okay? That was completely inappropriate. Greg took a deep breath. I'm just shocked. I've flown many times, but I've never been treated like this. Would you mind if I document what happened? Kate asked. This isn't right, and the airline should be held accountable. Greg nodded, still trying to process what had just happened. His perfect day had turned sour, and the flight hadn't even taken off yet. He touched his mother's medallion and tried to draw strength from it, just as he had done during his cancer treatments. He would need that strength to get through this flight with his dignity intact. Captain Harris and Diane returned from their private conversation 5 minutes later. Greg noticed that Diane's face was flushed, and she avoided looking directly at him. The rest of the first-class cabin had filled up during their absence, and the economy passengers were now filing past. Mr. Morris, Captain Harris said, approaching Greg's seat. I want to apologize for any misunderstanding. There is absolutely no policy against wearing a necklace in any section of our aircraft. You are welcome in first class, and we hope you enjoy your flight with us today. Greg nodded, feeling relieved but still uncomfortable. Thank you, Captain. Captain, Harris turned to Diane. Ms. Powell will be serving in economy today. Paul will be taking care of first class along with Lisa. He gestured toward a young female flight attendant who had just entered the cabin. Diane's lips tightened, but she nodded stiffly. Yes, Captain. Without looking at Greg, she turned and walked toward the back of the plane. As the captain returned to the cockpit, Kate leaned across the aisle again. That was handled well by the captain, at least, she said quietly. Yes, Greg agreed. I just wish it hadn't happened at all. I'm Kate Miller, she said, extending her hand. Greg Morris, he replied, shaking it. Thanks for speaking up. Was the right thing to do, Kate said. I fly a lot for work, and I've never seen anything like that before. Paul approached with a tray of pre-flight drinks. Water, juice, or champagne, he offered to both of them. Water, please, Greg said. I'll take champagne, Kate said. I think we could both use it after that scene. Paul lowered his voice. I'm really sorry about what happened, sir. That's not how our airline treats passengers. It's not your fault, Greg assured him. But thank you. After Paul moved on to the next row, Kate took a sip of her champagne and asked, Are you heading to Seattle for business or pleasure? Pleasure, Greg replied. I'm visiting my brother. It's been a while since I've seen him, and it's also the 5-year anniversary of my cancer remission. That's wonderful, Kate said with a genuine smile. Congratulations. What about you? Greg asked, glad for the distraction from the earlier incident. Business, unfortunately. I'm a civil rights attorney, and I'm meeting with clients about a discrimination case. Greg nodded toward where Diane had disappeared to economy. Sounds like you got some practice in today. Kate smiled. I guess I did. But seriously, what happened to you wasn't right. If you want to file a complaint with the airline, I'd be happy to help you draft it. Greg thought about it. He wasn't usually one to make formal complaints, but this experience had been humiliating. I might take you up on that offer. The safety demonstration began, and they paused their conversation. Greg tried to focus on the instructions, but his mind kept returning to the incident. He'd faced discrimination before because of his wheelchair, but this was different. Diane hadn't seemed bothered by his disability as much as by his necklace. It made no sense. After takeoff, the flight settled into a rhythm. Paul and Lisa served the first-class cabin efficiently and warmly. They brought hot towels, took meal orders, and made sure everyone was comfortable. Greg noticed that Paul seemed to be making an extra effort with him, which he appreciated. About an hour into the flight, Greg needed to use the restroom. First class had its own lavatory at the front of the plane, but getting there in his wheelchair wasn't possible. The aisle was too narrow. Usually he would wait until the aisle was clear, then use the seats to support himself as he made his way slowly to the bathroom. When Paul noticed Greg preparing to stand, he quickly came over. Can I help you, sir? I just need to use the restroom, Greg explained. I can manage, but thanks. Take your time, Paul said. I'll make sure no one gets in your way. Greg made his way slowly to the first-class lavatory. It was still a challenge, but having the extra space in first class made it easier than in economy. When he finished and returned to his seat, he found that Kate had moved to sit in the empty seat next to him. Hope you don't mind, she said. I thought we could continue our conversation more easily this way. Not at all, Greg replied. I was wondering about your necklace, Kate said. You mentioned it was from your mother. Greg touched the silver medallion. Yes. She gave it to me right before my first cancer treatment. She said it represented the tree of life and would give me strength. His voice softened. She died during my second year of treatment. Breast cancer. She was fighting it at the same time I was fighting mine. I'm so sorry, Kate said. That must have been incredibly difficult. Greg nodded. It was. But this necklace helped me through it. I know it sounds silly, but I really believe it gave me strength when I needed it most. That doesn't sound silly at all, Kate assured him. Objects can hold powerful meanings for us, especially when they connect us to people we love. As they talked, Greg noticed Diane passing through first class on her way to the galley. She kept her eyes down, avoiding looking at any of the passengers, especially him. Lisa, the other first-class flight attendant, came by with drinks. "Everything okay here?" she asked cheerfully. "Yes, thank you," Greg replied. After Lisa moved on, Kate lowered her voice. "Have you noticed that Diane keeps coming up to the first-class galley? That's the third time she's passed through." Greg shrugged. "Maybe she needs supplies from up here." "Maybe," Kate said, not sounding convinced. "But she always looks at you when she thinks you're not watching." It's strange. Greg hadn't noticed, but now he felt uncomfortable again. "Do you think she's still upset about earlier?" "Probably," Kate said. "But that's her problem, not yours." They were interrupted by an announcement from the captain that they were entering an area of turbulence. The seatbelt sign came on, and Kate returned to her own seat. The plane began to bounce and shake. Greg gripped his armrests, never having been a fan of turbulence. He closed his eyes and took deep breaths, trying to stay calm. Without thinking, his hand went to his mother's medallion, holding it tightly. When he opened his eyes, he found Diane standing in the aisle next to him. She had a strange expression on her face as she stared at his hand clutching the medallion. "You need to return to your assigned section," Paul told her firmly, appearing behind her. Diane seemed startled, as if she hadn't realized she was standing there. "I was just checking that all passengers have their seatbelts fastened," she said. "Quickly, I've got it covered," Paul replied, his tone professional but cool. Captain's orders were clear. Diane nodded and turned to go, but not before giving Greg's necklace one last look. There was something in her eyes that Greg couldn't quite identify. Not the hostility from earlier, but something deeper, almost like pain. As the turbulence continued, Greg wondered what was really going on with Diane. Her fixation on his necklace seemed personal somehow, but he couldn't imagine why a simple silver medallion would provoke such a strong reaction from a stranger. Kate caught his eye from across the aisle and raised her eyebrows questioningly. Greg shrugged, equally confused by Diane's behavior. One thing was becoming clear. There was more to this situation than a flight attendant being needlessly strict about a non-existent dress code. Something about Greg or his necklace had triggered Diane deeply. The question was, what? The turbulence finally subsided, and the captain turned off the seatbelt sign. Paul began preparing the cabin for meal service. Greg tried to put the strange encounter out of his mind and focus on enjoying the rest of his flight. After all, he had a celebration waiting for him in Seattle, and he wouldn't let one person's unexplained hostility ruin that. But as the carts came out, he couldn't help glancing toward the back of the plane, wondering what exactly had made Diane Powell single him out. Little did he know, the answer would change both their lives in ways neither of them could imagine. Lunch service began in first class about 2 hours into the flight. Paul and Lisa rolled out carts with hot meals that smelled delicious. Greg chose the chicken dish, while Kate selected the pasta option. The food was much better than what Greg was used to in economy class. As they ate, Greg started to relax a little. Maybe the rest of the flight would be uneventful after all. "So, what does your brother do in Seattle?" Kate asked between bites of her pasta. "He's a doctor at a children's hospital," Greg replied. "He was my biggest supporter during my cancer treatment. He even flew across the country every month to be with me for my chemotherapy sessions." "Sounds like a great brother," Kate said. "The best," Greg agreed. "He's the reason I fought so hard to beat the cancer. I couldn't let him down." As they continued talking, Lisa came to collect their empty trays. "Can I get you anything else?" she asked. "I'd love some coffee," Greg said. "Same for me," added Kate. "Coming right up," Lisa said with a smile. When she left, Kate lowered her voice. "Don't look now, but Diane is watching you again from the galley." Greg resisted the urge to turn around. "I don't understand why she's so focused on me." "I don't either," Kate said. "But it's definitely strange." Paul arrived with their coffee. As he set down Greg's cup, he said quietly, "I want to apologize again for what happened earlier. Diane is usually one of our best flight attendants. I've worked with her for years and I've never seen her act like this before. Greg was surprised. Really? She seems so cold, Paul supplied. She's not usually like that at all. She's normally very warm with passengers. I don't know what got into her today. This information made Greg even more confused. If Diane was typically a good flight attendant, why had she singled him out so aggressively? After Paul moved on, Kate said, "That's interesting. I wonder what triggered her behavior." "I have no idea," Greg replied. "But I'd like to find out." An hour later, Greg needed to use the restroom again. As he made his slow way down the aisle, he noticed Diane standing in the galley. She quickly turned away when she saw him, busying herself with organizing drinks on a cart. Greg used the lavatory and was washing his hands when turbulence hit again. The plane shook, and he had to grip the sink to stay upright. When the shaking subsided, he opened the door to find Diane waiting, right outside. "Oh," Greg said, startled. "Excuse me." Diane didn't move immediately. She was staring at his necklace again, and Greg noticed her hand go to her neck, as if reaching for something that wasn't there. "Is everything okay?" Greg asked, unsure what else to say. Diane seemed to snap out of whatever thoughts had captured her. "Yes. Sorry." She stepped aside to let him pass. As Greg made his way back to his seat, he glanced back and saw Diane still standing there, watching him with that same pained expression. When he told Kate about the encounter, she frowned. "Something is definitely going on with her. It's like your necklace means something to her personally." But how could it, Greg wondered. It's just a simple silver medallion with a tree of life design. They're pretty common. "Maybe she has one like it," Kate suggested. "Or maybe someone she knows does." The mystery of Diane's behavior continued to bother Greg. He tried to focus on the movie playing on his screen, but his mind kept returning to the strange flight attendant and her fixation on his necklace. Halfway through the movie, Greg noticed Paul and Diane having an intense conversation in the galley. They were speaking in hushed tones, but their body language suggested they were discussing something serious. Paul looked concerned, while Diane seemed upset, almost on the verge of tears. Greg quickly looked away when Diane glanced in his direction. He didn't want her to think he was spying on her. "Something's happening," he whispered to Kate, who had moved back to sit beside him after lunch. Kate looked toward the galley, just as Paul put a comforting hand on Diane's shoulder. "Whatever it is, it looks personal," she observed. A few minutes later, Paul came by with another round of drinks. His usual cheerful demeanor seemed subdued. "Is everything all right?" Greg asked as Paul handed him a glass of water. Paul hesitated. "Yes, everything's fine. Just some staff issues." Greg took a chance. "It seems like Diane has some problem with my necklace." "Do you know why?" Paul looked uncomfortable. "I'm not sure it's my place to say anything." "Please," Greg said. "If I've done something to upset her, I'd like to know." Paul glanced around to make sure no other flight attendants were nearby. Then he lowered his voice. "Your necklace. It's very similar to one that Diane's father wore. He passed away 3 months ago." Greg felt a chill run through him. "From cancer?" he guessed. Paul nodded. "Yes, the same type you had, actually. Diane mentioned you're a cancer survivor when we were talking just now." "I am," Greg confirmed. 5 years in remission. Her father wasn't so lucky," Paul said sadly. "He fought hard for 2 years, but in the end, well, Diane took it very hard. They were extremely close." Suddenly, Diane's reaction made more sense to Greg. Seeing his necklace must have reminded her of her father, and knowing that Greg had survived while her father hadn't probably stirred up complicated feelings for her. "I had no idea," Greg said. "That explains a lot." "It doesn't excuse how she treated you," Paul said firmly. "But yes, I think seeing your necklace triggered something in her. She's been struggling since her father died." After Paul left, Greg shared what he'd learned with Kate. "That makes sense," Kate said. "Grief can make people act in strange ways, but like Paul said, it doesn't excuse how she treated you." "No, it doesn't," Greg agreed. but I understand a little better now. As the flight continued, Greg found himself thinking about Diane and her father. He knew firsthand how devastating cancer could be, not just for the patient but for their loved ones too. His own mother had lost her battle, and he still carried that grief with him every day. The medallion around his neck was as much a reminder of her as it was a symbol of his own survival. Greg looked down at the silver tree of life on his necklace. For him, it represented hope and strength. But for Diane, a similar medallion must now be linked to loss and pain. The captain announced that they would be beginning their descent into Seattle in about 30 minutes. Greg felt conflicted. Part of him was still angry about how Diane had humiliated him in front of the other passengers. No amount of personal grief justified that kind of behavior, but another part of him felt sympathy for what she was going through. "What are you thinking?" Kate asked, noticing his thoughtful expression. "I'm thinking about how the same symbol can mean such different things to different people," Greg replied. "This necklace gives me strength and hope, but for Diane it seems to represent pain and loss." Kate nodded. "That's often true of symbols. Their power comes from the meanings we attach to them." As the plane began its descent, Greg caught sight of Diane in the aisle. She was helping a passenger stow a bag, her movements efficient but her expression distant. When she finished, she turned and her eyes met Greg's. For a moment, they just looked at each other across the cabin. Then Diane quickly looked away and disappeared into the back of the plane. Greg wasn't sure what would happen when they landed. Would he file a complaint against Diane as Kate had suggested? Or would he let it go, now that he understood a little more about what might have prompted her behavior? He didn't know yet. But as the plane dipped below the clouds and the city of Seattle came into view, Greg realized that this flight had become about much more than just getting from one place to another. It had become an unexpected intersection of two very different journeys through grief and survival. The plane landed smoothly at Seattle-Tacoma International Airport. As passengers prepared to exit, Greg remained in his seat, waiting for his wheelchair to be brought up from the cargo hold. This was always the hardest part of flying for him, being the last to leave while everyone else rushed past. Kate gathered her things but made no move to join the line forming in the aisle. "I'm in no hurry," she said to Greg. "I'll wait with you if that's okay." "You don't have to do that," Greg told her, though he appreciated the gesture. "I know I want to," she replied with a smile. "Besides, we haven't finished our conversation about whether you're going to file a complaint." Greg sighed. "I'm still not sure. Now that I know about her father, I feel bad for her. But at the same time, what she did was wrong." "Both things can be true," Kate pointed out. "You can feel sympathy for her loss and still hold her accountable for her actions." As they talked, the cabin emptied. Paul approached them once the last economy passenger had passed. "Your wheelchair should be here in about 10 minutes, sir," he informed Greg. "Is there anything you need while you wait?" "No, thank you," Greg said. "You've been very kind throughout this flight." Paul smiled. "Just doing my job. And again, I'm sorry about the situation earlier." After Paul walked away to help clean the cabin, Greg noticed Diane standing at the back of the first class section. She seemed to be gathering her courage for something. Finally, she approached Greg's seat. "Excuse me," she said, her voice much softer than it had been during their first encounter. "May I speak with you for a moment?" Kate gave Greg a questioning look, silently asking if he wanted her to stay. Greg nodded slightly, indicating it was okay. "Yes?" Greg said to Diane, his tone neutral. Diane took a deep breath. "I owe you an apology. My behavior earlier was completely unprofessional and unkind. There is no dress code that prohibits necklaces in first class or any other part of the plane. I made that up, and I'm truly sorry." Her voice shook slightly as she continued. "Paul told me he explained about my father. That's not an excuse for how I treated you, but I wanted you to know that I wasn't acting like myself today." Greg studied her face and saw genuine regret there. "Thank you for the apology," he said. "I'm very sorry about your father." Diane's eyes filled with tears. "He fought so hard," she whispered. "For 2 years. He wore a medallion just like yours every day. He believed it gave him strength. She swallowed hard. When I saw yours, it brought everything back, but that's my issue to deal with, not yours. I understand, Greg said gently. My mother gave me this medallion before my first treatment. She died during my second year of fighting cancer. This necklace is my connection to her, and a reminder that I survived when the odds were against me. A tear slipped down Diane's cheek. My father believed he would beat it too. He kept saying the medallion was working, even toward the end when it was clear it wasn't. She wiped the tear away quickly. I'm sorry, this is unprofessional. It's human, Kate said kindly. Diane nodded gratefully. The company will be notified of my behavior today. If you wish to file a formal complaint, I completely understand. Greg thought about it. The hurt and embarrassment he had felt earlier were real. But so was the grief he saw in Diane's eyes, a grief he understood all too well. I haven't decided yet, he said honestly. Diane nodded. That's fair. I just wanted you to know how sorry I am. She reached into her pocket and pulled out a business card. This has my work email on it. If you do decide to file a complaint, I'd appreciate knowing so I can be prepared. And if you don't, well, I'd like to know that too. Greg took the card. Thank you. A ground crew member appeared at the door of the plane with Greg's wheelchair. Mr. Morris, your chair is ready. I'll help you, Paul offered, coming forward. As Paul helped Greg transfer to his wheelchair, Diane stepped back. She gave Greg one last apologetic look before turning and walking toward the back of the plane. Once Greg was settled in his chair, Kate grabbed both their bags. Let me carry these for you, she offered. Thanks, Greg said, for everything. You really made a difference today. I'm glad I could help, Kate replied as they moved toward the exit. What are you going to do about Diane? Greg thought about it as they made their way up the jet bridge. I don't know yet. Part of me thinks she should face consequences for her actions, but another part feels like she's already suffering enough. It's not an easy decision, Kate agreed. Whatever you choose, I support you. They reached the terminal and paused. Which way are you headed? Greg asked. Downtown for my meeting, Kate said. You? My brother's picking me up. He lives in Bellevue. Kate pulled out her business card and handed it to him. If you want to talk about the complaint or anything else, give me a call. And if you're ever in Boston where I live, maybe we could meet for coffee. Greg smiled and took the card. I'd like that. They said goodbye, and Greg wheeled himself toward the arrivals area where his brother would be waiting. As he moved through the busy terminal, he thought about the strange flight he'd just experienced. What had started as a simple trip had turned into something much more complex. He pulled out both business cards, Diane's and Kate's, and looked at them. One represented a painful beginning, the other a promising new friendship. Life was funny that way, how something difficult could lead to something good. Greg spotted his brother waving from the crowd. Alan Morris was tall like Greg with the same dark hair and friendly smile. When he saw Greg, his face lit up with joy. Greg, Alan called, pushing through the crowd to reach him. He leaned down and gave his brother a warm hug. Man, it's good to see you. How was the flight? Greg hesitated. It was interesting. Alan raised an eyebrow. Interesting good or interesting bad? Both, I think, Greg replied. I'll tell you all about it on the way to your place. As they headed toward the parking garage, Greg found his hand going to his medallion again. The silver tree of life felt warm against his palm. For 5 years, it had represented his victory over cancer. Now, strangely, it also connected him to a grieving flight attendant who was still learning to live with her loss. Greg had come to Seattle to celebrate his survival. But perhaps there was room in this celebration for something else too. For compassion, for understanding, and for the recognition that not everyone's battle ended the way his had. Some fights were lost despite all the courage and hope in the world, and those who remained had to find their own way forward, just as he had. That night, in his brother's guest room, Greg took out his phone and looked at Diane's business card, again. He hadn't decided yet what to do about the complaint. But he did know one thing. Tomorrow was the 5th anniversary of the day his doctor had told him he was cancer-free. It was a day worth celebrating. And somehow, after today's flight, the victory felt both sweeter and more solemn than before. Greg spent a wonderful week with his brother in Seattle. They visited the Space Needle, took a ferry to Bainbridge Island, and ate fresh seafood at Pike Place Market. Alan had even arranged a small party with some friends to celebrate Greg's 5 years of being cancer-free. Throughout all these activities, Greg found himself touching his silver medallion often, drawing strength from it as he always had. But he also thought about Diane Powell frequently. Her business card sat on the nightstand in Alan's guest room, a reminder of the strange encounter that had started his trip. By the 5th day of his visit, Greg still hadn't decided whether to file a complaint against her. "What's bothering you?" Alan asked as they sat on his balcony watching the sunset over Lake Washington. "You keep getting this faraway look." Greg sighed and told his brother the whole story about Diane, the medallion, and her father's death. Alan listened carefully. When Greg finished, he asked, "What are you thinking of doing?" "That's just it," Greg replied. "I don't know. What she did was wrong. She humiliated me in front of other passengers and tried to make me feel like I didn't belong in first class." "But," Alan prompted. "But I understand her grief," Greg said. "I know what it's like to lose someone to cancer, and I know what it's like to have objects that remind you of them become almost sacred." Alan nodded. "It's a tough one. What does your new lawyer friend suggest?" "Kate says I should do whatever feels right to me, that I can feel sorry for Diane and still hold her accountable." They sat in silence for a moment, watching the sky turn from orange to deep purple. "You know," Alan said finally, "as a doctor, I see people dealing with grief every day. Some handle it well, some don't. But one thing I've learned is that healing often needs more than just time. Sometimes it needs connection." Greg thought about this as he went to bed that night. Connection. That was what his medallion represented to him. A connection to his mother, to his own survival story, to the strength he'd found during his darkest days. For Diane, her father's similar medallion now connected her only to loss. The next morning, Greg made his decision. He picked up his phone and composed an email to the address on Diane's card. "Dear Ms. Powell," he wrote. "This is Greg Morris from Flight 372 last week. I've been thinking about our interaction and your apology. I wanted to let you know that I will not be filing a formal complaint about the incident." He paused, considering his next words carefully. "I understand that grief can affect us in unexpected ways. I lost my mother to breast cancer during my own treatment, and I know how objects associated with loved ones can trigger powerful emotions. Your apology seemed genuine, and I believe everyone deserves grace during difficult times." Greg hesitated, then added one more paragraph. "I hope you find peace as you continue to process your father's passing. If it helps, please know that for me the Tree of Life medallion represents not just survival, but the connection between those who've gone before us and those who remain. Perhaps in time, your father's medallion can become a symbol of connection rather than loss for you too." He signed his name and sent the email before he could second-guess himself. 3 days later, on the morning Greg was set to fly back home, he received a reply. He was eating breakfast with Alan when his phone chimed with the notification. "Is that from her?" Alan asked, noticing Greg's surprised expression as he looked at his phone. Greg nodded and opened the email. "Dear Mr. Morris," Diane had written, "I cannot express how much your email meant to me. Your kindness and understanding in the face of my inexcusable behavior is humbling. Thank you for not filing a complaint, though I would have completely understood if you had." Greg continued reading silently. "After our interaction, I realized I need professional help to deal with my grief. I've started seeing a therapist, and I've taken a short leave of absence from work to focus on healing. Your words about the medallion being a symbol of connection rather than loss brought me to tears. I never thought of it that way before." The next paragraph made Greg's breath catch I wanted you to know that I've made a donation in your name to the American Cancer Society. I've also signed up to volunteer at a local cancer support center. My father would have wanted me to channel my grief into something positive, just as you've done with your survival. The email ended with, I wish you continued health and happiness. Your strength and compassion have made a difference in my life. Thank you. Sincerely, Diane Powell. Greg lowered his phone, feeling a mixture of emotions, surprise, gratitude, and a sense of closure. Well? Alan prompted. What did she say? Greg handed him the phone. As Alan read, his expression softened. Wow, he said when he finished. You made a real impact on her. I guess so, Greg said, still processing Diane's words. Are you glad you didn't file the complaint? Greg nodded. Yes, very glad. Later that day, as Greg waited at his gate for his flight home, his phone rang. It was Kate. Hey there, she said when he answered. How was your week in Seattle? It was great, Greg replied. Really great. Did you ever decide what to do about that flight attendant? Greg told her about his email to Diane and her response. I think we both got some healing from it, he concluded. That's wonderful, Kate said, sounding genuinely pleased. Not many people would have shown that kind of compassion. It just felt right, Greg said. By the way, I'm flying back today. Not first class this time, though. Kate laughed. Well, hopefully without any drama either way. Listen, I was thinking, I'll be in your city next month for a conference. Maybe we could meet for dinner? Greg smiled. I'd like that a lot. As they talked about plans and possibilities, Greg realized that his trip had given him something unexpected. Not just a celebration of his 5 years of survival, but new connections. With Kate, whose friendship had started because she stood up for him. And strangely, even with Diane, whose grief had collided with his survival in a way that had changed them both. When Greg finally boarded his flight home, he took his seat in economy class and settled in for the journey. The plane was crowded. The seats were smaller than in first class and the service was more basic, but none of that mattered much to Greg now. What mattered were the connections he carried with him, to his mother through her medallion, to his brother who had supported him through his darkest days, to Kate whose friendship was just beginning, and even to Diane, whose pain had opened a door to healing. As the plane rose into the clouds, Greg touched his silver Tree of Life medallion. For 5 years it had been a symbol of his victory over cancer. Now it meant even more. It was a reminder that even in our worst moments, connection is possible. That sometimes when we open ourselves to understanding another's pain, we create space for unexpected grace. The medallion caught the sunlight streaming through the window, sending silver reflections dancing across the cabin. Greg smiled. Life was full of unexpected turbulence, but also moments of surprising beauty. He was grateful to be here to experience both.